Disruption of traditional knowledge. Colonialism significantly disrupted indigenous knowledge systems by imposing foreign governance, education, and economic structures. Indigenous ways of understanding agriculture, medicine, and governance were often dismissed as primitive, leading to the loss of centuries-old wisdom. This erasure weakened cultural identities and self-sufficient practices. Suppression of indigenous languages. Language is a core component of indigenous knowledge. Colonizers often banned native languages in schools and public life, forcing indigenous people to adopt European languages. This suppression made it difficult to pass down oral traditions, myths, and scientific knowledge, leading to the decline of many indigenous dialects. Loss of traditional healing practices. Many indigenous communities had well-developed medical systems based on herbal remedies and spiritual healing. Colonial powers often replaced these practices with Western medicine, dismissing indigenous healing as superstition. While some traditional practices survived, much valuable medical knowledge was lost or ignored. Displacement and environmental changes. Colonialism often involved the forced removal of indigenous people from their ancestral lands. This not only disrupted their way of life but also severed their connection to nature. Indigenous knowledge of sustainable farming, water conservation, and biodiversity management suffered as traditional lands were exploited for colonial economic gain. Introduction of Western education systems. Colonial education systems prioritized European history, science, and philosophy while undermining indigenous knowledge. Generations of indigenous children were taught to disregard their ancestral wisdom in favor of Western perspectives. This led to a gradual erosion of indigenous intellectual traditions and self-sustaining skills. Commercial exploitation of indigenous knowledge. Many indigenous knowledge systems, particularly in medicine and agriculture, have been exploited by colonial and corporate interests. For example, traditional plant-based medicines have been patented without proper recognition or compensation for indigenous communities. This exploitation continues today under the guise of scientific discovery. Resistance and knowledge preservation. Despite colonial pressures, many indigenous communities have preserved their knowledge through oral storytelling, rituals, and cultural practices. Some have integrated Western education while maintaining traditional teachings. Today, there is growing recognition of the value of indigenous knowledge in areas like climate resilience, conservation, and holistic health. Revitalization efforts and indigenous rights. Indigenous movements worldwide are working to reclaim their knowledge systems through language revival programs, cultural education, and legal recognition of their intellectual property. Governments and organizations now acknowledge the importance of indigenous wisdom in addressing global challenges such as climate change and sustainable development. The lasting impact of colonialism. The effects of colonialism on indigenous knowledge are still felt today. However, efforts to decolonize education, healthcare, and environmental practices offer hope for the revival of these rich traditions. Recognizing and respecting indigenous knowledge is essential for creating a more inclusive and sustainable future.